Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm David Rubenstein, editor-in-chief of SD Times, and thanks for joining us for today's SD Times live presentation. It's called Threat Landscapes, an Upstream and Downstream Moving Target. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. First, this session is being recorded and will be available online on sdtimes.com within the next 24 hours or so you can look out for it then and play it over and over again to your heart's content. Secondly, today's session is going to be followed by a live Q&A. So at any point during the presentation, if you have a question, just go over to the chat area, type it in, and we'll get to as many as time allows. All right, so as we've been reporting in SD Times, applications today have obviously many moving parts. There's proprietary, I'll say it again, proprietary code, off-the-shelf components, there's data and open source that all come together to create the application. And so with all these pieces and the API connectors that tie them all together, the overall attack vectors for hackers has grown as well. In today's session, we'll look at the software supply chain and how attacks against these kinds of applications can be mitigated. Joining me today is Teresa Mammarella. She's the developer advocate at Sonatype, and she's going to show us the way. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you. Once again, my name is Teresa Mammarella. I'm a developer advocate at Sonatype, and I focus on open source technology, particularly in the Java space. Today, I want to talk to you about the threat landscapes that we're facing in the modern software space. And I will try to answer the following questions for you. First one is, what do Christmas, toilet paper, and the weekend all have in common? The second one, what is a software supply chain? What is the impact of open source technology on the software supply chain? And finally, how can software supply chain attacks be mitigated? To answer the first question, I want to start off by telling you a little story. So I live in Toronto, Canada, and my family is also from Canada. And this past December was the first time I spent Christmas with my in-laws. I wanted to get them really awesome gifts so I could make a good impression on them. They live on a beautiful island in the Pacific Ocean in British Columbia. And since I live on the other side of the country, I was planning to send gifts to them. Well, turns out that just before the holidays last year in BC, there were some huge floods that disrupted local supply chains. It was so bad that gas was being rationed for a while, grocery store shelves were bare, and shipments everywhere, including my holiday gifts, were delayed. So we had to make some last-minute pivots to get gifts for them on time. But I don't think any of us, especially in North America, are strangers to supply chain disruptions. Remember in 2020, when grocery stores could not stock toilet paper fast enough? This was a mostly funny way to illustrate to us how fragile the supply chains of our world can really be. But what does this have to do with software? We can also think of software development as a type of supply chain, where, for example, the suppliers are third-party projects such as open source that are used to develop applications. The warehouses can be component repositories like Artifactory or Nexus repository. The manufacturers and the manufacturing process is done by software development teams, and the finished goods are software applications that are distributed to customers. Now, I want you to all take a step back and think, have you ever personally been responsible for the failure of a software supply chain? Now, if you've ever worked as a professional software developer, you should be nodding your head right now. We all create bugs and make mistakes. Hopefully, we don't test our code in production, and are following best practices on how to write clean, performant, scalable, and secure code. However, not all the code in applications is really under the control of a single developer. We go back to our supply chain example and we focus on that supplier's aspect. That third-party code can cause a lot of disruptions and failures on its own and may not be something that application engineers have direct control over. An example I thought of for this that impacted more than just software developers, but in fact, thousands of people in the country that I live in, was an outage from Rogers, which is one of the biggest internet and phone providers in Canada, that earlier this summer had a 19-hour nationwide outage across the country, and 25% of the country's internet traffic was down. Now, needless to say, had a lot of friends and coworkers that just couldn't show up to work that day. And the cause of this huge outage? A simple coding error that disrupted the routing traffic and made the service unavailable for the entire country. This had massive impacts. 911 emergency services were down for a while. Nobody could use their debit cards, some credit cards, and ATMs. Internet services were down, phone services were down. And to tie back into my initial question, the weekend concert had to be postponed as well due to this huge impact and this coding error that was completely out of our control. And how this ties into open source technology is that we're seeing more and more that enterprise applications are using a ton of open source. In fact, roughly 90% of applications are using open source technology. And open source is really great. It allows us to deliver value to our customers quickly and is the foundation of most applications. But due to the community nature of it, which has many upsides, that the modern digital infrastructure starts to look a little bit like this. Now, I'm not trying to pick on any maintainers at all. That may be or may not be the weak link in a tech stack, but it becomes harder and harder as there's more and more layers of software building on top of each other to actually know what's in these applications. You might be choosing, say, the parts at the top. I want to use Kubernetes, for example. But that project could be pulling in hundreds or thousands of other projects that you may not even be aware exist. These are called transitive dependencies. And it becomes very, very difficult to know what exactly is inside those applications. And one aspect of supply chain failures that I'm concerned about is security. And with all these stacked dependencies that some are better maintained and more reliable than others, it becomes more and more likely that a failure in the suppliers can occur. One example of this that happened pretty recently was a hijacking incident, or a series of incidents really, in the JavaScript space. Last year, a very popular package was hijacked, and what hijacking means is that someone took over the account of this project for NPM, a place where JavaScript developers get their projects, pretended to be the maintainer, uploaded a new version that was injected with crypto mining software. This particular project gets 7 million downloads every week and is used by big tech companies like Facebook, Amazon, and Google. So the amount of people that could possibly have been downloading this malware was huge. And this is far from an isolated incident. Another example of a big supply chain attack that you may or may not have heard of is Log4Shell that was found in Apache Log4j. If you're not familiar with Log4j, this is a logging framework for Java applications that is used nearly ubiquitously throughout the industry. What was so bad about this attack was that an attacker could basically remotely execute any code they want by figuring out how to inject it into a variable in the logging system. The impact of this was that it had a reasonably low effort of it to be exploited, and once you figure it out, you can basically do whatever you want. And once it was made public that this was an issue, it was a matter of hours or a matter of minutes where it was starting to be exploited, and scanning was detected to find out what applications are using these vulnerable versions. This tweet was published, just a few hours after it was publicized, and really was before most software developers in North America had even thought about waking up or had their morning coffee. So finding about this sort of after the fact is a little bit late, and there were some pretty real-world consequences to this. For example, there was a fintech firm in Vietnam. They actually patched their Log4j in a reasonable time frame after a patch came out. However, it was too late by then. And by that time, bad actors had already left a backdoor into their system, came in later and stole personal information of 2 million customers and held it for ransom. Governments were affected by this as well. And in the US, the Federal Trade Commission soon after issued a warning that they would pursue legal action against companies that failed to take reasonable steps to protect their data from exposure for Log4j or similarly large vulnerabilities. So back to our supply chain. If you take those two examples, the hijacking example and Log4j, we can think about this as there are 3 points of attack on a supply chain. The first one is upstream. Upstream is from those suppliers, so downloading open source or third-party projects. So that the npm hijacking example is an example of an upstream attack. The next area of attack is midstream, or somewhere in the software development lifecycle. Log4j is a good example of this. It's a tool that developers use to help get feedback for their builds. The third one is downstream. This is the one that we normally think about when we think about hack, something that's happening in the live deployed application. So upstream, midstream, and downstream, this all makes me think of a river, and there is a good reason for that. Or a waterfall, keeping with my theme of Canada, Niagara Falls, where, think about it, the water that is upstream moves faster and spreads more widely than does the water in the midstream or the downstream of a waterfall, or a river. And those upstream attacks can have the most impact on software supply chains. And all that has a potential to come from open source attacks. So there are approximately 10 million open source repositories on GitHub, and many of those projects get distributed by the hundreds of thousands and millions to open source repositories such as NPM, Maven Central, and PyPI. And the most popular ones are typically what we see as the ones that are the most targeted because they have the most number of downloads. So Sonatype did a study that, when examining the top 10% of most popular projects in these languages, that approximately 30 of them contained at least one known security vulnerability. Whereas for the less popular ones, there are less of them that are known. And what that tells us is really that, one, there's more security research done on these popular packages from both the black hat and the white hat side. We're also seeing that the supply of open source is increasing. And this comes from two different pieces. First is that it's becoming more and more popular to build and to develop in the open. The second is from reasons like the hijacking example that I mentioned, or various bad packages and social engineering that bad actors are trying to get developers to download. Yes, social engineering is not just the email from a prince in the Middle East asking you to send him money. It can also be as simple as rearranging the name of an open source project and someone like me forgetting what it was called and saying, oh, I'll just try this, or I'll just try that in my command line, and downloading something malicious. The demand for open source projects is increasing as well. Seeing more and more developers are wanting to use these types of projects and finding valuable, and more companies investing in it as well. And because of this huge opportunity, bad actors are also trying to exploit these packages more and more quickly. It used to be that you had on average about 30 days, about a month from when a vulnerability was publicly disclosed to when you had to patch and fix it. That gave a pretty nice buffer. But now that window no longer exists. And just like with Apache Log4j that I talked about earlier, people are being exploited before patches even exist. That's what's meant by 0 day. There was a study from Cortex Expanse Attack Surface Threat Report showing that when a CVE disclosure comes out, that's a public disclosure of a vulnerability, that they're seeing scanning for vulnerable applications within 15 minutes or less, whereas the average global enterprise needs at least 12 hours. And as I mentioned previously, the motivation for this is huge. And if you didn't know, cybercrime is now officially bigger than the drug trade in terms of profit. In fact, it's about 1.5 trillion times more profitable. There's a lot of zeros here, but basically it's saying that the global cybercrime damage costs $6 trillion US per year, which is $190,000 a second. And between cybercrime and the drug trade, guess which one has the least amount of risk? Which one is growing the fastest? And which one is the hardest to prosecute for? Cybercrime. And despite this, for Log4j again, for example, we're actually still seeing that about 33% of daily downloads are still of vulnerable versions. It's been almost a year since this vulnerability was disclosed, and it's been highly publicized. My father-in-law, who only knows about Java as the little pop-up on his computer, even knows about it. And so it's not because I think there's not enough awareness or developers are being irresponsible. It's actually because it's really difficult to know where exactly you might be using Log4j. Think back to those transitive dependencies I was telling you about. Now, this is a diagram created by deps.dev, which is a visualizing tool that was created by Google to show off the dependencies and transitive dependencies of various open source projects. And this is an example of one just to give you an idea of how complicated a single third-party project can be in terms of dependencies. there could be log4j in here that could be pulled in multiple times, and it can be really difficult for developers to know that. It's an ongoing problem that a lot of different companies are trying to solve currently. So that's the issues that we're facing today. So how can you actually prevent software supply chain attacks? Well, the first thing I recommend doing is automating that dependency tracking. That diagram we just looked at before, that's just one component when enterprise applications can have hundreds of components that they're pulling in. And the amount of transitive dependencies is way too much for one person to be able to understand. So we need technology to really be able to do this properly and to be able to mitigate our vulnerabilities quickly. If you don't know where log4j is being used, you really can't do a whole lot to stop being exploited. So as I said, we can't be manually tracking dependencies. This needs to be automated with tooling. Another thing to consider is that there are many different types of dependency tracking. And so some of it is as simple as looking at a manifest file and saying, okay, I'm using these 10 projects. Let me make sure none of those are vulnerable. But it goes deeper than that in terms of those transitive dependencies, but also in terms of looking out for things like hijacking. And so it's not enough just to be looking at versioning, for example. I also recommend finding a tool that analyzes those binaries to look for malicious code patterns. One thing I wanted to call out when searching for tools is that there are actually a couple different types of scanning that you'll see out there. One is that as declared scanning, where we're just looking at what is listed, declared directly for an application. But then there's as observed scanning, which is taking those and looking at the transitive dependencies and the dependencies that may not be explicitly listed. And as you can see, that list can be a whole lot bigger. The next thing to think about is this buzzword we've been hearing in the industry that is shifting left. And what that means is giving the power of fixing security vulnerabilities and vulnerable packages to developers for the simple reason of economics, and that it is much cheaper to be fixing bugs or security concerns earlier in the development process. And the way to do this is not to put more burden on developers and be making more work for all of you. It is to provide meaningful insights to be able to do this properly. And I encourage you to all go out and look for your own great tools, but one, since I am from Sonatype, that I would encourage you to check out is the OSS Index. And these are open source scanning tools that provided for most of the major language ecosystems that can help scan dependencies and identify ones that may or may not need to be upgraded. These are all free, and you can even contribute to them if you want to. The next thing I wanted to mention is that Sonatype also has a suite of enterprise level tools looking at package dependencies at all areas of the software development lifecycle. For example, there's the Nexus firewall, which does that binary scanning I mentioned before packages are allowed to be downloaded. Lifecycle, which tracks them along the way and would catch issues like log4j. And Lift, which is one of the newer products, which is also free. That is a static analysis scanning tool. And the thing that's cool about all of these is that behind all of it is what we call Nexus Intelligence. And really, for any of these tools, they're only as good as the data that's behind them. And for Sonatype's Nexus Intelligence, there are 10 million unique vulnerabilities. Many were identified by Sonatype security researchers, but they also have public CVEs as well. But for those public CVEs, most of them have been augmented to be more precise. And so they're able to pinpoint the exact source of a vulnerability in the package to reduce noise in the data. Typically, they're about 12-hour fast checks, but it's usually much less when a new vulnerability is disclosed. And the researchers are keeping customers up to date until a deep dive analysis is complete on new vulnerabilities. So that's just something I'd encourage you to check out. A few other resources that I have for you that will also be shared in the handouts tab of your call is, the root of solving this problem is really going to be education and making developers more aware of secure software. So I've linked a free training course from the Linux Foundation that's really useful in understanding more of these problems and knowing what to look for in application development. Some information about security scorecards. That's been an interesting project that the Open Source Software Foundation is taking on, and many open source foundations as well are looking at it. The state of the software supply chain, which is where many of my facts and figures came from. And finally, if podcasts are more your thing, Wicked Good Development has been created by a coworker of mine, and they talk a lot about the challenges that are facing open source development and security in today's industry. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. That was great. I would remind people, if you have a question for Teresa, please type it into the chat now. Use the public area, and we'll answer as many as we can get to. I was kind of curious about something, Teresa, when you were talking about automating the dependency tracking. So people are talking about continuous automation, that everything along the whole SDLC needs to be automated. But things change in applications, and so who's managing the AI? Like the models need to change or be updated, things like that. How is that something that the tool provider would take care of, or is that something that's incumbent upon the user to stay on top
of? So for tools like Nexus, that would be something that the provider is taking care of, I would say, in terms of, that's sort of the idea behind using the tools, is that, you don't need to know all this information yourself, because it's just way too much for any one person or any one team of people to know, but that you can hopefully be able to trust that whatever tool you choose is keeping up to date and has your best interest in terms of knowing what the latest and greatest is for whatever it is that you're automating, whether it's dependency scanning or testing or something else.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, so I would just ask, one of the attendees actually just asked a question about specific resources and or good reads that you could pass along to their boss to encourage better practices related to this type of thing. I think you showed a few. Maybe if you put the links into the chat, people could, I know you put some white papers in the handouts and some things like that. But maybe that last slide where you had all those links.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think certainly the state of the supply chain white paper is a good place to start, just in terms of understanding the problem space and also the scope of it. So I think that is really what we're seeing at Sonatype. A big part of the issue is just that a lot of developers aren't really aware of the scope of this problem through no fault of our own, just because it's not something that traditionally developers have had a lot of education in.
Right.
Yeah, but on top of that, there's a lot of free tools to try out and just take a look and see if anything comes up in your application. And that can be a great way to have that conversation too. Look at all these things that this tool identified. Maybe we should look a little further into this.
Yeah, well, that's certainly good. All right, so what would be the main takeaway that our attendees here today can take back to their jobs and their bosses, and what would be the one thing that they should really take from this session today?
Sure, I think one of the main takeaway should just be that security isn't something that the landscape is changing, and it's no longer just about sending your application off to your security team and hoping they find something. Like I said, the problem is too big to be solved by just depend on one set of people. Developers also need to be educated in this, at least a little, to the point where they can, be using these types of tools and understand the meanings behind them.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. I was like, even with the tools, I mean, there still needs to be some training for developers so that they can understand what some of the issues are and what some of the vulnerabilities are.
Yeah, absolutely. I also linked in, like I mentioned, training that's a free course from the Linux Foundation. A lot of the courses they have on this type of course are paid for, but they thought that this one was so important that they made it free for everyone. So I'd encourage, it's a really good way to get an overview of what secure applications look like, and get a nice little LinkedIn badge too.
And as my grandfather used to say, if it's free, it's for me. So
I like that.
I encourage all the attendees. To check that out and take the course. All right, Teresa Mamarella, thank you so much for your time, developer advocate at Sonatype, and thank you to Sonatype as well for sponsoring today's event. I also would like to thank all of the attendees who hung out here with us today. Thank you for your time. And I would just say until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, editor-in-chief of SD Times. So long for now.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Teresa. Okay.